Hello and welcome to this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. My name is Ken Zimmerman Jr., and this is the podcast dedicated to the history of professional wrestling from the 1860s to 1930. And in this episode, I'll be talking about the match from 1898 between Yusuf Ismail, the original Terrible Turk, who made a huge impression in a 6-month tour that he took in the United States in 1898. And one of the matches he wrestled was against future, at the time, American Heavyweight Wrestling Champion Tom Jenkins. But first, I wanted to talk about a discovery I made this week. I found the first wrestling card that I ever attended with my sister Vicky in St. Louis, and it was the Friday night card on June 12, 1981 at Kiel Auditorium. So at the risk of boring my regular listeners who have probably heard me tell this story many, many times, I am part of a blended family. We were that before people were using the term. But in June of 1981, my mother, Patricia Ellis, soon to be Diaz, married the love of her life, Ernest Charles Diaz, who was my stepfather, but he raised us, and me and my two natural sisters consider him our father. Dad had 5 daughters from his previous marriage that from that point on just became our sisters. So the 8 of us don't call each other step. We don't consider each other anything other than brothers and sisters. So the 8 of us became a blended family. And my oldest sister, Vicky, was 15 years older than me and was a professional wrestling fan. And she had season tickets to go to the professional wrestling matches in St. Louis at the time. But she didn't go because she didn't have anybody to go with her. And when we were introduced to our sisters a couple months before our parents married, my oldest sister, Vicky, came up to me and said, "Hey, I heard that you watch wrestling at Chase." And I said, "Yeah, I do." And she said, "I have season tickets, but I have nobody to go with me. Would you be willing to go with me?" I was like, "Absolutely, I would be willing to go with you." And unsurprisingly, very quickly, she became my favorite sibling. And Vicky had always wanted a little brother. So besides having somebody to go with her to the wrestling matches, which was her big motivation, it also allowed us to bond. And she had always wanted a brother, and now she had a little brother, and she was pretty happy about that. And it helped that we tended to like the same wrestlers and tended to dislike the same wrestlers. I knew that somewhere around the time Mom and Dad got married, Vicky took me to my first card, but I could not remember the exact time. And I don't remember her ever picking us up or picking me up at the flat on Osceola. So I thought the first card we went to was after Mom and Dad got married, and we moved on to Villa. And actually, that's correct. It was the weekend after my parents got married. So Vicky picked me up at my parents' house, and then we drove downtown. I was 12, so I was riding with Vicky while she drove us downtown. Before I get into the match card and everything for that, I will say that Kiel Auditorium could be a rough place in the 80s. You know, that the fans were calmer than they were in a lot of cities, but there were some rough goings on down there. And I tell people to this day, the toughest sibling in our family was Vicky, not me. And I've seen her freeze lecherous men in their tracks. And besides the fact that my sister was beautiful, she would dress to the nines to go to these wrestling matches. So she usually wore a pantsuit and these big hats. Today we'd call them a pimp hat, but they were these big brimmed hats she would wear down there. I'm 12 years old. I'm useless if anything starts up at this point in time. But nothing ever did. Nobody ever messed with us. And Vicky and I always went to the wrestling cards unmolested. And I'd just seen her give people a look. We used to call it Vicky's look. She could give somebody a look and just freeze them right in their tracks. And I copied it and got pretty good at it myself because after I turned 18 and filled out, I could do the same thing. But nobody was tougher than Vic. And the night that we went down there, I knew that the first card we went to, I was pretty sure it was Ted DiBiase versus Harley Race in the main event. So you would go into Kiel, and we had tickets on the floor. So I think we were 8 rows back. We weren't in the front row. We were about 8 rows back, which was great until it got really interesting and everybody started standing up on their chairs. And who was responsible for that was the front row, because the front row would stand up when the action got going on the floor. And then the people behind them would have to stand on the chairs so they could see. So then everybody's standing on chairs. Well, I'm 12. Even if I stand on the chair, I'm not going to be able to see over anybody. So Vicky would spend the next minute or two yelling at everybody to sit down so people behind them could see what was going on. The other thing is smoking was still allowed at public buildings in 1981. That wouldn't change until the early 90s. So after about the first match or two on the card, the Kiel Auditorium would be so filled with smoke, but you could barely see the ring by the end of the night. And Vicky was a smoker, so she'd be smoking too. But it was like watching a wrestling match in a smoke screen. So the smoke filled arena thing was a true thing, but Vince McMahon did not end that. The anti-smoking laws and public buildings ended that. So to go through the card that day, the opening match was Spike Huber, who was Dick the Bruiser's son-in-law, defeating Steve Lawler in 6 minutes. The second match was Rufus R. Jones, who was over as a babyface in St. Louis, but he was what I always considered the line. He was the mid-card babyface that if you beat him, you were in line for a title shot at either the Missouri Championship or the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. If if you were a babyface or a fan favorite and you beat Bulldog Bob Brown, the same thing. Bulldog Bob Brown was aligned for the baby faces or the fan favorites. If you beat him, then you were going to be up for a shot at the Missouri title or the NWA heavyweight title. He was the mid card guy. One of the things that killed St. Louis as a promotion after Sam retires on January 1st, 1982, Sam Muchnick, the longtime St. Louis promoter, is they tried to push Bob Brown and Rufus R. Jones as main eventers because they were Bob Geigel's Pizos, one of the guys that bought St. Louis from Sam Muchnick, and the fans were never going to accept those guys in that role. Rufus would have had an easier time being accepted as a main eventer than Bulldog Bob Brown would have, because Rufus R. Jones was over. I know people look at him today and they look at the work and they're like, how was this guy over? But I'm telling you, he was over like Rover in St. Louis. People loved him. In the third match, Jack Briscoe defeated Bobby Heenan. And you're going to notice on this card, there's a little bit of AWA presence, and that's because Vern Gagne always had a small piece of the St. Louis promotion. Well, always. He had a small piece of the St. Louis promotion toward the end of Sam's tenure. So there was normally one or two people from the AWA, and then most of the talent was from around the NWA. Then Rocky Johnson and Bulldog Bob Brown defeated J.J. Dillon and Buzz Tyler. This was during Bulldog Bob Brown's implausible run as a fan favorite in St. Louis. Bulldog Bob Brown was the kind of guy that as soon as he opened his mouth in a interview, you wanted to punch him. He did get over for a short time as a fan favorite, but I have no idea how, because for years people would throw trash at him. in a time when St. Louis fans never rioted and never tried to attack the wrestlers. I think Bob Brown is one of the few people that people took a shot at. So this was a pretty improbable run. And then in the about right underneath the co-main event and the main event, well, I guess there was he also had the Battle Royal this day. So Kerry Von Erich, who was just getting over in St. Louis, and Dick Murdoch brawled to a double disqualification. And this is 81. So Kerry had only been in wrestling for like a year. David was a huge star in St. Louis. Kevin to a lesser degree, because Kevin never came up to St. Louis nearly as much as David did. And David was being groomed for a NWA World title run. So David was always more over than Kevin. My two favorite wrestlers when I started watching wrestling in 1979 were David Von Erich and Ted DiBiase. And that's why I was pretty sure that Ted DiBiase was on the top of the card in the first card me and my sister went to. And what would have been the co-main event if it wasn't for this 18-man battle royal, Dusty Rhodes and Dick the Bruiser defeated Ric Flair and Ken Patera when the referee disqualified Ric Flair. Flair threw somebody over the top rope, probably Dusty. Then the co-main event was an 18-man battle royal that was won by Pat O'Connor. Now, Pat O'Connor at this time would have been close to 60 years old, but he was the booker in St. Louis. And he was still someone that people accepted as legitimate because he had been the world champion from 1959 to 1961. He had legitimate Olympic wrestling credentials, which we're also going to talk about when we talk about the review today. People accepted him as he was a legitimate wrestler. He had matches with Ric Flair that were competitive on St. Louis TV in 1980 and 1981 on Wrestling at the Chase, and people accepted and bought Pat O'Connor as a legitimate tough guy. And Dick the Bruiser, who was in his 50s, who would have been way past prime, I believed when I was a kid, that was the toughest human being on 2 feet and the last person on earth you would want to mess with, because he just had that aura about him, even though at that point in time he was an old guy. He's still muscular for his age and everything, but he was in his 50s and could have passed for his early 60s. And then finally in the main event, Harley Race won the best 2 out of 3 falls main event for the world title. And what surprised me about that is when I went and looked, that match went less than 30 minutes, which was very unusual in St. Louis at the time. Most of the main events went almost an hour. I'm guessing because of the 18-man battle royal going so long, that's what took up so much time and why the main event only went 30 minutes over all 3 falls. I'm going to change up the format a little bit this week because in the update, I do go over quite a few of the news items that have come up in the last few weeks in modern wrestling. So I wanted to jump to first the recommendations and the review before I get into the main topic. And then we'll close up with the update at the end of the show. And remember, you can always get all the show notes for this episode or any episode at kenzermanjr.com. And you can find the show notes for this episode at kenzermanjr.com/episode 94. So my recommendation for this week, and I was going to have 2, but now I've got 1. The first one is for a couple of matches from AEW All Out in 2021. I just had a chance to review that a week or so ago. And I thought that the match between Jon Moxley and Satoshi Kojima was pretty good. And not a whole lot of garbage wrestling in that one. And then I thought CM Punk's debut match in AEW versus Darby Allin was also a pretty good match. Well worth checking out. I also was going to recommend a show on Max called Duster, but they've already canceled it, so no reason to recommend it. when it's going to leave you with a cliffhanger that's never going to be resolved. For the review, initially I was going to do Central States All-Star Wrestling, but I think next week it's going to be Caleb and Trey with me. So I wanted them to see that that show from April 5th of 1986. So I'm going to wait and keep my thoughts on that until next week. And what I wanted to talk about was one match that I'll put up the link to in the show notes. And that's a match. It has to be from the 1950s, and it's from Montreal. And it is a match between Maurice Vachon, who we all know as Mad Dog Vachon, but this is right after he got into wrestling. So for those that aren't familiar, Maurice Mad Dog Vachon was a skilled Olympic level wrestler and went to the 1948 Olympics for Canada at only 19 years of age. While he didn't win there, he did win gold at the middleweight division at the Commonwealth Games in 1950 as a 21-year-old. And then right after winning that, he got into professional wrestling. Vachon initially planned to, because Montreal and Quebec City, the whole province of Quebec, had a developed professional circuit there that he thought he could make his living working for Eddie Quinn. But Eddie Quinn was very reluctant to even put Vachon in the main event because he was afraid if he put Vachon in the main event, when Vachon wrestled Yvan Robert, he would shoot on him, double cross him, and beat him. I don't know if that's apocryphal or not, but by the 1950s, the NWA is around now. There are definitely ramifications for wrestlers if they try to double cross and shoot on somebody in the NWA. So I don't know if this was just a fear that Eddie Quinn had, if it's apocryphal to build up the reputation of Vachon even more. But for whatever reason, Vachon never became a big star in Quebec at that time. He would later on, but he eventually had to move on and go to other places, Portland, AWA. He was a mainstay heel there for a long time. We probably best remember him as the fan favorite in the 1980s when he was, nearing 60. He would be 60 in 1989. But in this match, he is a year or two into his career, and he's wrestling Larry. Now, it's spelled Moquin, Moquin, but I've heard it pronounced when he was wrestling Gorgeous George in Los Angeles as Moquin. So whether it's Larry Moquin or Larry Moquin, they wrestle in the second match on the card in Montreal, and it goes about 9-10 minutes. The whole clip is 11 minutes long, and for the first 7 minutes of that, they're just going back and forth in a wrestling match. Very little brawling. Vachon definitely is setting himself up as a heel. He refuses the handshake at the beginning of the match. He's rough on some of the breaks and stuff like that, but he doesn't just haul off and hit him until about 7 to 7.5 minutes into the match. And then about 7.5 minutes into the match, he starts punching him, throws him on the ground, stomps on his face a couple times. And after the third time he does the foot to the face on the mat, the referee disqualifies him. And this is before he was the Mad Dog, but these are the kind of tactics that he would use to get his Mad Dog Vachon persona over. I thought it would be interesting for people to get a look at Vachon before he was Mad Dog Vachon and see the differences. He's short, stocky. Nobody could ever accuse him of being good looking, even when he was younger. But he's not quite as scary looking as he would be later on in this match. So I'll put a I'll put a link to the YouTube clip up on the show notes. And with that, I think we're going to get into the main content for today's episode. And I've said this in the past, but I'm going to repeat myself because maybe people didn't hear those episodes. Yusuf Ismail is had one of the most dominant 6-month campaigns in professional wrestling in history in the late spring, summer of 1898. Ismail was famous for two things. One, the other way he dominated Tom Jenkins and Evan Strangler Lewis, two of the greatest catch wrestlers of all time. And at that time in the United States, the only wrestlers that could give them a run for the title of greatest American professional wrestler at that time was Martin Farmer Burns and Dan McLeod, who was the current American heavyweight wrestling champion. McLeod and Ismail never wrestled. So where you see histories that have Yusuf Ismail as an American heavyweight wrestling champion, he was never American heavyweight wrestling champion because he never wrestled the current champion, nor did he wrestle Farmer Burns. He beat Jenkins before Jenkins was the American heavyweight champion, and he beat Evan Strangler Lewis after Lewis had dropped the title years earlier to Martin Farmer Burns. He also was known for his frequent fouling. So Ismail was a dirty wrestler. In one of his early matches, he got disqualified for knocking Ernst Rober off of they were on a stage, and a lot of the stages were in opera houses or auditoriums and that. So there would be an orchestra pit in front of the stage. And he charged and knocked Rober off the stage into the orchestra pit, which was about a 9-foot fall, and seriously injured Rober's shoulder, and he was disqualified for that. And in this match, he would continue those techniques. Even though he was utterly dominating the wrestling, he would still use these dirty techniques. So Ismail wrestles Tom Jenkins on May 5th, 1898, in Tom Jenkins' hometown of Cleveland, Ohio. And Ismail wrestled less than 10 matches on this 6-month tour, but he left a path of destruction that people still talk about to this day. Well, historians remember to this day. The general public might be a little bit hard pressed to tell you who Yusuf Ismail was. And in this match, Ismail displayed both his dominance and his poor sportsmanship. So Ismail, they say for this match, weighed 248 pounds. Now, I don't think Ismail, and he was 6'2", I don't think Ismail was ever under 280 at the lowest. So maybe they said he was 248 to try to make the size disparity with Jenkins, who was 172 pounds, seem, less insurmountable. But normally Ismail was between 280 and 310 pounds. So I doubt he went on some kind of diet and lost 32 pounds for this match. That sounds to me more like promotional tactic than it does actual weight loss. And the size disparity showed almost immediately. So Ismail's tactics for this match was just to pick Jenkins up and throw him all over the mat. And several times he did try to throw Jenkins off the stage into the orchestra pit. But Jenkins, knowing what had happened to Rober, held on like his life depended on it. Maybe it did, because he had such a death grip on Ismail. Ismail had a very hard time even shaking him off. So when they would be over the mat, Ismail could just slam him and go down on top of him. But when they were near the pit, the orchestra pit, Jenkins was holding on so tight. The only way Ismail could have thrown him was if Ismail was willing to go down into the orchestra pit with him, which he was not willing to do. Because Ismail was pissed that Jenkins kept holding on and throttling him from throwing him off the stage, when he would get Jenkins down on the mat and Jenkins would try to roll to his feet, Ismail would put his forearm in the back of his head and shove Jenkins' face into the mat and then just rub his face against the mat. So Jenkins ended this match with mat burns all over his face. Most of the time, the mat on a stage was that kind of canvasy. It's not like the mats we think of today. So it'd be like a piece of canvas stretched over the floor with a little bit of padding. Sometimes it was just a real thick carpet that had some padding to it. So either way, whether it was canvas or whether it was a rug, that's going to tear your face up pretty badly. And apparently, Jenkins, it took him a few weeks for his face to heal up. Ismail also palm struck Jenkins in the head several times, besides rubbing his face into the mat. After 1 hour and 1 minute, Ismail was finally able to pin a bleeding and mat burned Jenkins for the first fall. Ismail, despite his huge size, he was in good shape. You couldn't take that away from him because even though he was throwing Ismail around like a rag doll, he never got tired and never got wore out. He had the endurance to keep up this offense the whole time. And Jenkins probably was hoping that he would wear himself out and that would give him a chance to be able to defeat Ismail, but never occurred. Ismail, the whole time, was able to keep his cardio up. Jenkins and Ismail start the second fall, and Ismail starts shoving Jenkins and shoving him off of the mat. And Jenkins lets him shove him off the mat as long as he's going stage side. If he is going towards the orchestra pit side, Jenkins again holds on to Ismail like a spider monkey and is not going to let go and get shoved off into the orchestra pit like Rober did. During one of Jenkins' attempts to re-enter the ring, Ismail picks Jenkins up and slams Jenkins onto his back, but they are off the mat, which is normally not legal. But this time the referee awarded Ismail the second fall. And newspaper reporters, Jenkins seconds, all point out to the referee, hey, he was off the mat. You cannot count that as a fall. But whether the referee was tired of watching this and he thought Jenkins has no hope of beating this guy. We just need to end this before he takes any more punishment. Whatever his motivation was, the referee refused to change his decision, despite the fall not being a legitimate pinfall. Jenkins continued to argue with the referee, but the referee was unmoved. So the fans, remember, we're in Cleveland, Ohio. We're in Jenkins' hometown. The fans are not only ticked off because they've been watching their hero just basically get manhandled for an hour, hour and a half of this wrestling match. They've seen the guy that came in to take on their hometown hero, try to throw him into the orchestra pit, and he had a history of throwing people into the orchestra pit. He rubbed the hero's face into the mat and gave him mat burns and made him bleed, and then pinned him with an illegal fall. So the fans now start throwing stuff at Ismail, and they're trying to hit. Now, Ismail is 6'2", 280 to 310 pounds. And these fans are so enraged, they're trying to hit him as he makes his way back to the dressing room area. The referee follows a little bit after that, thinking, oh, they're not going to be. And they start really going after him. Now, they might have been thinking, I'm not sure if I can whoop Yusuf Ismail. But they're thinking we can whoop this referee. So they start pummeling him. And the Cleveland police have to surround him and get him the rest of the way back to the dressing room. Jenkins is disappointed, but in all honesty, after what the guy does to Evan Lewis too, fans forgive this loss pretty quickly. And within 3 years, he will be wrestling Dan McLeod for the American Heavyweight Wrestling Championship. And Jenkins is one of the only people that ever had success with Frank Gotch. He and Frank Gotch had 8 matches, but only 6 of them were competitive. The last 2 matches Jenkins had with Frank Gotch were after he had taken the full-time position at West Point to be the self-defense instructor. So West Point is the U.S. Army's academy in the United States. And Jenkins was their self-defense and physical training instructor, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years. And when he takes that position, he still wrestles part-time for a few more years, but he's not in the shape that he was in. He's no longer competitive, and he's definitely not competitive with Frank Gotch. But in their 6 competitive matches, they split those evenly, 3 matches to 3. No other wrestler has more than one victory over Frank Gotch, and all of those were avenged. So Jenkins was by far, in a way, Frank Gotch's toughest opponent. So why didn't Frank Gotch wrestle Yusuf Ismail? For one thing, he wasn't a professional wrestler yet. Frank Gotch does not get into professional wrestling until 1899, and then he meets Farmer Burns that same year, who starts training him for the ring. And so he wouldn't be the Frank Gotch we think of until 1903 or 1904. Ismail, after the 6 months, is going to set sail back for Bulgaria. However, the ship he books passage on, which I believe was the SS Burgoyne, it sinks off the coast of Canada, killing most of the passengers on board. In fact, it's one of the worst uh, disasters at sea in this time period, and it led to some changes within the shipping rules, and that because it's famous that most of the crew survived and most of the passengers died, which is not supposed to happen. But there were witnesses who said that basically the crew commanded all of the lifeboats, and they would only let passengers in after they had taken care of themselves. Whether it's apocryphal or not, Ismail went down with the ship, and was supposedly because he didn't trust. He wanted to make sure he had the money because he came over here to tour to get the money to open a coffee bar when he went back to Bulgaria. He had all of that money in coins in a band around his waist. And supposedly that is what helped pull him under the water and sunk him. Whether that's apocryphal or true or whatever, Yusuf Ismail dies in that wreck. And he was in his early 40s. So Ismail is just manhandling some of the best professional wrestlers in America in his early 40s. So you could only imagine what he was like when he was in his 20s and 30s. You also wonder why he fouled, because he really didn't need to. But Gotch fouled as part of his strategy to win. Evan Lewis fouled just because he was mean and nasty. Yusuf Ismail was probably just mean and nasty as well, and that is why he chose to take the tack that he did, but he didn't need to. So the legend of Yusuf Ismail, one of the greatest professional wrestlers of the 19th century, and by far probably the most successful 6-month tour of the United States of any foreign wrestler at that time. That's the history topic for this week. So I wanted to end with a couple of updates, because many of these updates are more modern wrestling. I know a lot of the listeners don't like that, so I always try to save those for the end. The Divided Championship is now out and available on Amazon in ebook, audiobook, paperback, and hardcover. So it's on Amazon in all 4 forms. This week, and I'm recording this on July 20th. This week, as I'm recording this on July 20th, I will be getting the book up on Ingram Spark as well, so it will be available in bookstores and libraries in just a few months. I got a picture of the match drawn by one of our longtime listeners. So somebody on Facebook, one of our longtime listeners, Ripper, sent me a picture that he drew of the match between Evan Lewis and Gallagher, who was the police wrestling champion, from their match in Buffalo. And this is the match where the 6 Buffalo police officers invaded the ring because Lewis was choking Gallagher with the point of his elbow after the Buffalo Mayor banned the stranglehold in the middle of the match. And I just thought this picture was fantastic. It's a great artist rendering of that match. And that's really Lewis. We've got a few pictures of him posing, and we've got like an artist rendering of him putting a stranglehold on somebody, but very little out there on Evan Lewis. I have never seen a picture of one of his matches. Hopefully, we'll find some someday. But as of this point, I have never seen a picture of any of his wrestling matches. I've not even seen an artist rendering in the newspaper of one of his wrestling matches. But maybe we'll luck out and I'll find some eventually. As far as the modern wrestling goes, Seth Rollins suffered a significant injury on Saturday night's main event. And depending on the source that you hear, it was either a work that they're building up to, which I find hard to believe under the circumstances, or it was a significant injury, which is what it looked like to me. Um, Definitely, LA Knight was not set to go over in that match. So that was something that was changed on the fly. And I don't think they would have done that if he's only going to be out for a short time because it kind of casts aspersion on him holding the money in the bank, et cetera, et cetera. Time will tell. Um, a lot of people have commented about how WWE is kind of rote. And what I think happened is I think their creative momentum was killed when The Rock stuck his big nose in the Cody Cena situation. And the Cena heel turn was a huge mistake. And they've been struggling to recover from it ever since. And it's not like it's horrible. They still have some very compelling storylines. Jacob Fatu versus Solo Sikoa. You've got Roman Reigns returning now, which is one of the other reasons I think Rollins' injury might be more significant than we thought. But time will tell. And I think the WWE will get their mojo back eventually. They just they got derailed a little bit. Um, and another injury, and this one is related to concussions. There's been a lot of conjecture that Adam Cole has been sick due to his significant weight loss and muscle loss. But now it appears that that's probably all concussion related. That's what his medical issues have been over the past couple years. And that's why I was hesitant to critique him because I thought he could be sick, or as we found out now, it was just the concussions. But that's what led to his physical decline. And I didn't want to say anything about how small he was, and he was very tiny. He had lost a lot of muscle. Hopefully, both he and Seth can make a quick and full recovery. I know that this injury for Adam Cole, he has alluded to, could be career threatening, but he should make the decision that's best for him health wise long term. But he's the only one that can make that decision. Nobody else can tell him, what he has to do. People have to know what they need to be happy, and they have to have the freedom to make those decisions. But we're hoping that everybody recovers quickly. When I say everybody, that's Seth Rollins and Adam Cole. We hope the best for both of you. Hangman Adam Page defeated John Moxley for the AEW World Title. Osprey and Strickland defeated the Young Bucks, who are no longer EVPs. While I'm glad that Page is getting another run with the AEW World Title, let's face it, that was a garbage match of garbage matches that they had. There is an audience for this, but there's an audience for most things. That's not an audience that's going to grow. This was a garbage match that didn't need to happen with two people that are more skilled, that they don't have to do that, but continue to choose to do that. And they're doing long-term damage to their bodies on something that everybody knows is a work. And how many sponsors are going to look at that match and say, yeah, this is something we ought to be sponsoring and getting behind? I don't think any of them have a business mind for how that plays for sponsors and why WWE and WCW back in the day, give Bischoff his credit, they went away from that except for only special circumstances. You didn't see it multiple times a year or multiple times a show. And I just think that it's not going to play well with sponsors, and that audience is not growing. Good on them for getting the new contract from TBS. Good on them for getting on Max. I've watched some of their shows, and they're not all bad. There's usually one or two good moments, and then there's a lot of direct you got to slog through. And that's what I thought WWE was under Vince McMahon. The difference under Vince was the matches were nothing to write home about because people were phoning it in, and the storylines were ridiculous. With AEW, the storylines are ridiculous, but a lot of the matches are better as long as they don't get into the garbage crap. So it's definitely a mixed bag. And my own personal bias is the professional wrestling that my sister and I enjoyed and liked died in the 1980s. It's not coming back. When Bret Hart and them retired after the 90s, most of the guys who could really go in the ring, you don't have that many people around like that anymore. And so you're not ever going to see the quality in the ring like you had back then. So that's my bias. You can disagree with me, and I don't hate you for it. If you disagree with me and you really like today's product, enjoy. I like some of it myself. I just think that by and large, it's not nearly as good as it used to be. I did not really revise my book plans, but besides revising the St. Louis Civil War, the streetcar strike of 1900, which was a class war with people armed with weapons. You had a posse of upper middle class people because the St. Louis Police Department did not have the manpower, and the police, because they were more working class, were more sympathetic to the streetcar strikers. The sheriff empowered a posse, which was mostly made up of upper middle class men, no military experience, and some upper class men as well. And you had the strikers, and you had people that were working on the streetcar, and they're all armed. So what happened when you have a bunch of people running around with guns who don't know which end of the tube the projectile comes out of? They shot more innocent people than they did people involved in any activity. And it was just a really rough 4 or 5 month period during that strike. So I want to revise that with some of the material I have available to me now. And then at the same time, I'm going to start on the 19th century professional wrestlers book, the one on wrestlers who had a career, who made a significant uh, difference on the business, but whose lives and career don't really, there's not enough material there for a actual book. But if we put 5 to 10 to 12 of them in one book, then we have a book length project. So I'm going to start that at the same time. I've done that before. I was writing Pesek and the Sherlock Holmes of St. Louis Chief of Detectives William Desmond book at the same time. So I'm going to try to do the same thing here. So hopefully the second edition of the St. Louis Civil War book will be out maybe Octoberish. And then hopefully by December or January, the book on the 19th century professional wrestlers will come out. That could take a little longer and go into early 2026. We'll see. And for that, I think I covered everything I was planning to cover this week. Next week, I plan it to be a group session with me, Caleb, and Trey. And we're going to try to do that about once a month. We've been talking about our schedules recently, and I think that that's doable for all three of us. The rest of the time, I'll just do solo episodes like I have been. People still seem to be enjoying them, and I enjoy putting them out. So as long as that's the case, I'll continue to do the solo episodes on the weeks that I cannot get Caleb, my, and Trey's schedule all in alignment. And so until next time, everybody, take care. Bye-bye.